Hi, welcome to a Roboflow training movie. In this training movie, I will show you how to update formula fields. This is part of the Cumulus 11.01 release in November 2017. In this release, you will find three new actions which allow you to update a formula field for a record and update a formula field for a category. Now you might wonder why you would require such a functionality in Roboflow while it's something that is executed automatically when a record is edited. Well, the reason is the following. Imagine that you have a catalog in which you have already a bunch of records and you've been using it, and now suddenly somebody decides that a certain field should become a formula field, or a new field is added and it should become a formula field. So let's consider in this example that you have in the catalog a status field, and that status field has been used and has a value, and records have a value accordingly. But now you want to use the label field for setting the value of the record, of the label. So you want to use the label field to reflect the status that has been set. So in that case, you would come to the sample catalog and look for on the records for the label field, and then you can configure it to use formula fields. So each time somebody changes something, a status, automatically it picks up the value from that status and assigns a color. So if, for instance, I go to this record, you notice that although it has a value, the status field, the label field does not, because the formula field was activated later than this value was set. So if I set this value, I could say, for instance, rejected, apply, and when I have a look now in the record, I can see here that it has the proper label. But all these other records do not. And that is, of course, a pity, because all these other records have to be updated. A way to do that in the client is just to select your records, and you can you can update the formula fields. The disadvantage of doing it this way is that this works fine for, let's say, 100 records, but if you have 100,000 records, then this procedure is not recommended this way, because it's blocking your Cumulus client, and your computer could even run out of resources talking to the Cumulus server for hours and hours and maybe days. So a more efficient way of doing this is do it in Roboflow, because also in Roboflow you can keep track of how far he's gotten, and you can see actually how many records he's done, which one he has done, which one he hasn't, which ones he hasn't, etc., etc. So what we do or can do in that case is we can go and build a workflow. Before running a workflow, I also want to show you that you can do exactly the same for an information window for a field of the category. Imagine you have a category field, and I created a category field called original name, and that has a formula field on it, and it will what it does is it keeps the original name. That means from the moment that the category is created, that is the name that it's going to store. So if I make a new category and I say test, then at that moment, information, I see that it has here test and then original name. Why is that? Because when you create a record, then it will automatically give it a name called category. And so in that case, if you do that, it fails, and your formula kind of fails. And so if I want to make sure that it has the value, I need to, you see for this one, for instance, it has never been done. It needs to find here the record. It needs to find here the category, sorry, and it needs to fire this again so that it stores it, so that when I change this value the next time, it will have the original value. So I created a little workflow here that does something very simple. It queries, it's a hot collection workflow, it queries the database, looks for any record whose status is filled in, has a value, and in the sample catalog. And then I'm just firing the update on the label field. You can specify multiple label fields if you want, by separating them by tabs or semicolons. But in this case, I just want to fire one. Why would you want to? Because if you do it through the client, it would update all your formula fields. So maybe you have 20, maybe they don't require updating, but you're forcing them to be updated anyway. And so it's a lot of unnecessary processing. Here, additionally, you can also decide whether you want the to update the modification date or not. So the next step I'm doing is I'm processing the categories assigned to that record, and that's just to get to some categories to process, and I'm doing there exactly the same thing, update formula field category, and that way I can fire on the original name field the formula, and that way it will gather the proper information from the record. It all does that depending on what you set in your formula field, and so it is not doing anything else than executing that formula field. So if I launch this workflow, start, we can go and have a look into, and we can do a show log, and you can see the records that it is processing. And if I now have a look in my catalog, let's scroll down a bit. The top ones we did manually, but if we check here down below, here we see some of the values being set. You can see the colors popping up. You might wonder, here is a field with a status approved. So approved is a value. Why does the label not have a value? Well, that has to do with the fact that our status field here has IDs 0, 1, and 2. When you're setting the value of the label, it's trying to pick up that value. 0 is the approved one, so when we fire that label, where's label? There's label. If we fire the formula field for that label, it looks for an ID with 0. So since we set in the formula field that in case we're trying to set a value that is not possible, if in case there's an error, well, leave the value untouched. The value untouched was no value, so it leaves it untouched. You could also force it to go to a specific other color in that case, but in this case it was just leaving the status as it is. So you can see that this has worked perfectly, and so it was nicely done. And what you can see as well is that the original name field of the category was also fired. So now if I change this, it will fire the formula field, but it will no longer change the value. Why is that? Nothing to do with Roboflow. This is just what we configured in, or what I configured in this particular formula field. I was saying if the original name, if this field already has a value, then I just keep that value. If the original, if not, If it's empty, then it's original, well, and then it's setting that value. And so that's just an example. Maybe it's not a useful formula field, but it's just showing that when you apply formula fields or modify formula fields and you need your database to be checked, then you can use Roboflow to make sure that all these different fields are updated. So thank you for joining this little training movie, and I see you in the next one.